Well, good morning, Neighborhood Church, Neighborhood Kids. I'm so glad to see you here for another story from God's Word, the Bible. We have been learning about the one true God who made the heavens and earth and us. We learned about his son Jesus in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have learned the history of the early church and the life of Paul as he went on several missionary journeys, taking the gospel into other parts of the world. And now we are getting a glimpse of how God is using him to encourage these new believers and us, and teaching them how to live lives that please God through letters that he wrote. And we are going to practice just saying the names of the letters that he wrote. They're all in blue. And in the New Testament, it begins with Romans. So let's start here. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Last week, we looked at the book of Galatians, and Paul had written that book after his first journey. He had gone with Barnabas up into Asia, specifically into Galatia, and when he came home, he wrote them a letter. And Paul and Barnabas had been the very first missionaries to go out and take the gospel to these other places. And we're going to see that Paul writes letters to these churches that he had found. Well, on his second journey, he had a different partner. He had Silas. And as they went along, a young man named Timothy also joined them on this second journey. And this time, they went over into Europe. We now call it Greece. And they would stop in different cities and they would tell people about God. Well, one of the cities that they came to was Thessalonica. And Thessalonica was on a very special road called the Via Egnatia. And it was a big enough city with 200,000 people at that time that they could actually have a synagogue. There were enough Jews living there. And we know that when Paul came to a city, he always went to the synagogue first because there was an audience. And he would tell the Jews about Jesus first. Well, in Acts 17, we saw on that second journey that when Paul and his friends came to Thessalonica, they were only there for about 3 weeks teaching on Sundays in the synagogue before they were run out of town. And Paul and Silas had to leave and go to the next city called Berea just to be safe from the people that were trying to come after them. There were angry mobs that would chase them. They did not believe the message that Paul had brought, and so they would leave town quickly. But Paul would leave behind new believers, and there were many of them. And Paul left Thessalonica so quickly that he had not had a chance to tell these new believers how to live lives that pleased God. And so later on, after they left, Paul and Silas and Timothy met down here in Corinth. And Paul was worried about these friends, these believers. He's like, are they standing firm? Did they catch the message? Are they being persecuted? He was very concerned. But Timothy came along and said, you know what? I was visiting them, and you will be so glad to hear that they are standing firm in their new faith. They are being persecuted, but they're doing good. And so Paul sat down to write a letter to them. And we call that letter 1st Thessalonians because that's who it was written to. And just like he started Galatians, he told us who. This time, it was Paul and Silas and Timothy that were writing the letter. And they were writing it to this church in Thessalonica. And they said, grace and peace to you. And Paul went on in the body of his letter, and he praised them for turning away from the idols and turning to the one true God. And he shared with them the hope that someday Jesus will return and take all the believers to heaven. And he said, you need to be ready for that. It hasn't happened yet, but it's kind of like having your bags packed and ready to go on vacation. Be ready for when Jesus will return. And then he said, you know what? God is a promise keeper. We can have hope because God is going to fulfill all of the promises that he has made. And they could trust God in that. You know, hope is having confidence or trust that what God says he will do, he will do. And the Thessalonians needed an extra measure of hope because they were being persecuted. They were being treated badly by people who didn't believe, by the city officials, and it was kind of hard for them. And then Paul closed his letter. He said, "Grace be with you." Well, not long after that, Paul heard that there were some rumors and some lies going on, and so he wrote a second letter to the Thessalonians, still in Corinth. And he reminded them this time that they needed to stand firm. Don't forget what I taught you, he said. Don't let other people try to teach you something that is wrong. And then he said, carry on. Don't stop doing what you know is right to do. Don't stop living life as a devoted fan of God. And Paul again closed his letter with, grace be with you. Well, what can we take away from these two letters today? What's for us? You know, just as Paul was reminding those new believers to stand firm in their faith, to live lives that pleased God and teaching them how to do it, that's what our hope is too. We have God's written word. We have the Bible we can look at and we can read. And when we know what God's word says, then we can live lives that are pleasing to God.